If you're building a no-code app to replace or improve an existing process within your market or your industry, there's a very specific path you want to follow. Now, to be clear, you can be building an app to provide a brand new solution that doesn't exist. But more often than not, when you're building an app, it's to replace or enhance some existing process in your market or in your industry. You just want to make the process better or easier, more streamlined. You want to package it up in a different way. Now there are different existing solutions that you could be replacing. These might be other apps or other software. They could be spreadsheets. They could be a combination of apps and spreadsheets, maybe connected by Zapier. They could be pen and paper, they could be email, post-it notes, whiteboards, anything. Any process, whether it's already app-based or not, can be replaced and improved upon. But again, there's a specific path that you want to take. When some people try to do this, they come into the no-code space and they want to create a better or more enhanced process. They try to build the biggest and the best right out of the gates. But really, you want to start by kind of taking a step back, stripping things down, and then building back up. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, make sure you stick around until the end because we're also going to talk about a free extended training you can join in on, which will take our conversation today many steps further and get you headed in the right direction. So stick around for that. Now, first, if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help business owners and industry experts build custom apps to either start their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses, all without coding and with no technical background required. So we're going to dive into this and go through these steps or this path that we talked about. And what I'm going to do is share my screen and we're going to jump over to the whiteboard here. So what you're trying to do is take an existing process. And again, existing process can happen in a lot of different ways. It can already be app-based, but it might be manual. So you're taking some existing process that could be improved upon or made different or maybe segmented into a certain market in some way. And you're really just packaging this up into a streamlined custom app that you're going to be building and delivering as a new solution. So we're going to break down how to go through this from a grassroots, more foundational level so that you can get started in the right direction and make sure that you're actually improving the process versus just muddying it up any further. So there are 4 steps in this process. And the first step that you want to go through is the refine step. And when you look at the existing process that you're looking to replace, chances are it is cluttered, it might be convoluted, it might be bloated. There are probably lots of steps. What we see in most cases is these processes are oftentimes a little bit confusing. There is too much thinking required by the user, the person going through the process. The processes usually aren't easy to go through. Often there's lots of human error, manual error, things fall through the cracks, especially when we're looking at business processes. This can really impact the business from a financial point of view, from an operational point of view. And so the very first thing we want to do is just refine the process. Okay, so when you're in this first step, you can kind of think of this as the time where you'll be building out the very first version of your app, your MVP, the really slimmed down version. So the way to sort of lay this out and make sure that you're building the correct version when you're refining a process is you first want to make sure you've identified the problem that this process solves and the outcome the process is aiming to enable. Now, the process really, or what will become your app, is just the thing that takes the problem, right? And it really just transforms it into the desired outcome. So if you think of the problem your target market is currently facing, kind of like their current reality that's over here, well, the outcome is over here, right? Your app is really, or your the process is really just a thing that transforms one into the other, or it takes the user from the problem to the outcome. So we're looking at the process as being right in the middle here. That's the thing that we need to refine. And so if you start by taking a step back and kind of taking a bigger picture view of this, if you truly understand the problem being faced and you truly understand the outcome your market or your users are looking to achieve, then you can start to strip away some unnecessary components of that existing process in order to slim it down and then streamline it. So what I want you to do is first just make sure you have a really good understanding of that. And then I want you to really just list the steps in the existing process. So when you're looking at whatever it is you're replacing or streamlining with your app, what are all the steps currently involved in that existing solution or that existing process? Now, this part might take a while, okay? So expect that going into it. But I want you to really take some time, take a step back, open up a Word doc or a Google Doc, and list out every single little step that you can possibly think of or identify, okay? Because once you do that, you have the big picture of the existing process, and that's where you can really actually refine, right? Which is the point of this step. So the next thing you need to do once you have all those steps is decide what's not necessary. Okay. Decide what's not necessary. Now, when you are creating an app that is providing a solution that doesn't exist yet, usually you approach this a little bit differently. You think about what is necessary. But if you're creating an app to replace an existing process, then you should already have a pretty good idea of what's necessary to solve that problem and produce the outcome. The thing you need to do now is decide what's not necessary. Strip it down. So look at that entire list that you come up with and anything on there that does not land itself right here, right? Right in this transformational, transitional point, anything that doesn't land there, then mark it as not necessary. Now, we're talking about the first version that you're creating of this app to replace this process. So things that might not be necessary now could potentially be necessary in some way or shape down the road, but we're looking at the most immediate right now. So remember that in this step, in step one, we're really creating your first version app or your MVP. Now, that of course is a whole process in and of itself. And we're not going to go into how to create an entire app in this video. We have lots of training on that. But it's important to understand that this is where you're really doing that. In this step one, you're identifying the most necessary features of the process. So once you have that, you're going to move on to the next step. So step two is making it easy. This is where a lot of people sort of fall off. The typical inclination when you are creating an app is to pack it full of features. Now remember, we're taking the opposite approach here. Instead of packing features on, we're stripping steps away. We're stripping it down. And now we really just want to make the app as easy to use as possible. Now, this is really important. It's important regardless. Obviously, you want any app to be easy to use. But when you're creating an app that replaces an existing alternative, that means that your target market or your prospective users already likely have a solution. So when you offer them a new solution, even if their existing solution isn't perfect for them, you still have to give them a reason to switch to a new solution. Okay, now again, even if their existing solution isn't perfect, it can be hard to get people to do that because they develop habits and they learn to live with things that they don't like. And sometimes it can be a harder initial process to make the switch, even if in the long term it's going to be a better transition. So you really have to make the app easy to use. Focus on ease of use, because the easier it is to use, the easier it is to switch over to. Okay, the easier it is to adopt. So again, if someone has an existing alternative they're already using, you want to make adoption easy. Okay, so that's our focus here in step 2. Now we're going to look at this in 2 layers. All right, we have 2 layers to our usability. Now, the first is to make the app itself, the features that you are creating that we went through in step number 1 in refine, make those easy to use. Now, we focus on usability design. Okay. So when we're creating first versions of apps, we're not focusing on aesthetic design and just making the app look fancy. In making an app easy to use, we actually look at design in a different way. We look at usability design. This is really just stripping away all the fun and fancy and flashy aesthetic things that you could put into an app. It's simplifying it, and it's just making the app usable. Now, there are some ways you can think about this at the start that'll make design a lot easier for you as well. And a lot of that focuses around just identifying trends. You really want to make your app as intuitive to use as you possibly can, because remember, we want to make it easy to adopt. Now, if you think about it, your target market, they likely use different apps on a daily basis. And when you use different apps, you'll start to see trends in certain processes, trends in how signups happen, in how registrations happen, in how similarities across different types of solutions like job platforms, for example. In a job platform, you'll see trends in how different processes happen, how posting a job happens, how applying for a job happens, and all these different things. You'll see trends in checkout pages or payment pages. You'll see trends across all different types of apps where there are commonalities in different types of processes. Now, the reason why this is so important is because if you design your app based on these trends, not from an aesthetic standpoint, but just from a navigation standpoint, from a usability standpoint, if you design your app based on those, your app is by default going to become more intuitive for users to use, because the chances are they've already gone through similar processes before. And so when they start to go through your process in your app, they're going to be able to reduce the amount of thinking that they need to do. Now, thinking is friction. Thinking is friction. So the more someone has to think as they go through your app, the more friction they're going to feel, and thus the harder it's going to be for them to adopt. Remember, we're talking about ease of use, easy adoptability. So look for trends and design based on those so that you can make your app intuitive to use by default. Now, a really easy way to start identifying these trends is just to look at the apps you use see where there's crossover in different processes that you might be creating that are also in other apps. Or you can go to sites like webframe.xyz, where there are literally collections of these trends that you can go and look at. You can pick out which processes that need to be in your app, and you can look at the trends and then design based on that. Remember, not aesthetically, but just from a usability standpoint. So that's the first layer of making your app easy to use. But the next thing you need to look at is beyond just the features and the processes that you're putting into your app and making them usable. You then want to go back up to looking at that existing solution. So you have that full list in step one of all the different steps, right? Well, the ones that you are keeping, so the ones that you're putting into your app, try to identify the biggest sticking points for people who are currently going through that existing solution or using that existing process. Okay, so for example, if someone is using an existing app that I'm trying to replace, then for the necessary features of the process of that existing solution, I'm going to go in and look and see where users are really having trouble. Now, if you are trying to replace or create a better solution to an app that already exists, you can usually find information on this just by looking online or talking to people. Talking to people is always ideal and very revealing. But if this is a process that already happens within your market or your industry, you probably already have some insight on this. You can look at the steps in the process, and this doesn't have anything to do with an app necessarily, but just which steps in the process are hard for people, which steps are confusing, which steps do they fall off on or do they trip up on, which steps lead to the most error. All right, look for that and then put an emphasis on those in your app. Put an emphasis on guiding people through. So I'm just going to say guide people through here. Now, what this can look and this can happen in a lot of different ways. So if you find those sticking points, you can add really simple visual cues to your app to help guide people through. You can add some information here. If it's a very difficult process, you can layer on even more intensive guidance. It really depends on the app and the market. This could be where calls are scheduled, where there's actually human interaction if it's a really big sticking point. It could be something as simple as a tooltip if it's a smaller sticking point, but just make sure that you know where these things are happening and guide people through. This doesn't have to be a really difficult thing that you create. It's just you looking at the existing solution or the existing process, picking out the hardest parts and making sure that you're guiding users through. Remember, usability, ease of use, adaptability, those all happen here. So that's step two. Now, when we go down to step three, this is where we start to add on. So we've taken that big process, we've stripped it down, and we've streamlined it into the base of our app now. Now we're going to build back up. We're going to add back on. So in step three, this is when you now start to make it more useful. Step two, make it usable. Step three, make it more useful. Okay, so this is when you can start to add on more what we call nice to have features. They're not necessary to make the process happen. They just make it better. They make it more convenient. Okay, that type of thing. So we want to start to layer. And this can involve lots of different things. And again, this really depends on your app and your target market and their needs, what they're telling you, what you're pulling from the data and the research that you're doing, the conversations that you're having. But these can be features for things like convenience. They can be user experience related. They can be speed related. So convenience, UX, speed, even enjoyment. They can be related to just people enjoying using the app. So lots of different things. And these don't have to be big features. They're just little nice to haves that you're adding on to make the app more useful, right? You're just adding it on. These can be some bigger features, but really it depends on the feedback that you're getting, right? The data that you're pulling from the people who either are actually using your app at this point, because they can be using your app at this point, or the ones who will be using it. And we'll come back in just a minute and talk about when you can start launching to your different test groups. But you can be getting feedback here and letting that guide you on how to make it more useful. But one of the things you want to remember is to make sure not to clutter the app. So avoid recluttering, right? So remember, we stripped it down for a reason. It's to reduce a lot of the bloat and the excess that the process doesn't actually need in order to achieve the outcome, right? We stripped it down for a reason. We made it usable. Avoid just recluttering it. So as you build it back up, you want to build it back up with pinpointed features or iterations. The rule of thumb is anything you add back on, there has to be a reason. It has to be attached to some sort of outcome. So if you're adding on a feature or an enhancement to this process now that you're packaging into your app, what is the goal of that specific addition? What's the outcome it's going to help your users achieve? Don't let your app now have its own list of unnecessary features or steps, right? So just remember to avoid recluttering. Now, that's going to take us all the way down to step 4. And this is where a lot of people like to start. And we put this down closer to the bottom. Make it more aesthetically appealing, okay? So if you have a refined process that is usable and it is continuously more useful, then you can start focusing on more of the aesthetic design components. Now, if you followed this process as we've gone through it, you should have a simplified design, an intuitive design, but you likely won't have a really fancy design. You shouldn't at this point. If you do, it means that you're prioritizing in the wrong order. Put the priorities in place first, and now you can focus on some of the aesthetics because these still matter. They just matter at a certain time, right? We want to do the right things at the right time. So what I want you to do when you get to this point is don't design based on what's fancy. So don't do what's fancy just because you like the way it looks or you saw someone else do it. All right, remember, we're very goal-oriented and outcome-oriented in how we build our apps. You want to design based on what's more usable for your users and what makes your app more of a joy to engage with. Okay, sometimes you can have a really streamlined process and just adding on some more of a visual appeal can just make the app more of a joy to use. And that sounds pretty simple, but we like to simplify things here, and this is what works. So design it based on what's more of joy to use. Again, still focusing on usability. Not just what looks cool, but what is usable. So what we like to do in terms of design is keep it simplified, right? Keep it simplified. The more you add on, the harder it is to design. If you're doing this on your own, you're not hiring an outside designer, then it's so much easier if you just keep it simplified. Okay, try not to add too many conditions just because of the way they look. Try not to add too many backgrounds or shadows or anything like that. Keep it simplified. Make sure you have white space. Make sure that when you look at the screen, it doesn't feel cluttered. Make sure that there aren't tons of options or calls to action, things that users can do at every single step. Try to keep it simplified. Try to keep it focused. Every step of your app or step of the process should have one specific goal. So if you follow kind of these rules of thumb, then your design is automatically going to be more appealing. But this is when you can start to think about that more and you can start to take a deeper dive into some of the aesthetics. Now, it's important to understand when you should be launching, because I don't want you to get all the way down here and wait to launch until you've now already put all of these aesthetically appealing touches in place. So if I zoom out here and we look at all of these steps, I know this is really small here, but we have here step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4. You really want to launch right here. So after steps 1 and 2. Now, remember that step 1 is when you refine, okay? So you take the current process, you strip it down, and you find what's not necessary, okay? You build that out into your first version or your MVP. And step 2 is when you make it easy to use. You make it usable. You design based on trends. You try to make your app more intuitive so that it's easier to adopt. Because remember, you're taking people who are likely using a current solution and you're trying to bring them onto something new. Even if this is happening within your own company, it can still be hard to take employees even from the existing solution they're using and to onboard them onto something new. So it's really important that you do these steps correctly and you launch at the right time. You don't have to wait to launch. So launch after step 2, because once you do that, your next step, step 3, is to make it more useful. And if you've launched after step 2, well, now you can be getting feedback on what's going to actually make it more useful. You don't want to guess, because the more you guess, what will happen is the more you will reclutter the app. And we don't want to just kind of repeat the cycle of having this cluttered process, right? So launch, get the feedback to help you avoid recluttering. And you'll continue to make it more useful as you bring more users on or as you continue using this new solution for your processes, because you'll continue to get feedback. That's what we do ourselves. That's what our clients do, right? That's the most straightforward way to go about this. And then you can start to add on the design touches. And those can happen through feedback as well. They can happen through intaking where the sticking points are, where people might be falling off or having trouble. But really, if you follow this process, then you can take any existing solution, whether it's app-based or whether it's manual, and you can streamline it, package it up into your own custom app. And you can do this all without coding with no code tools. So hopefully this is helpful for you. I went through this process obviously quickly and in one go. And in reality, as you're going through it yourself, it's going to take time at each stage. It's going to take time in the refine stage. It's going to take time to make the app usable, useful, and all of that. So you can stretch this out over time. But hopefully you find that helpful. Now, if you're moving forward with your app, if you're just getting started, or if you have started, but you want to make sure that you're headed in the right direction, we do have an extended training. This is what I mentioned at the beginning of this video, and it takes a really deep dive into some of these initial strategic steps that you need to put in place when you're starting out with your app. We talk about how to make sure you're you're putting the right features in place at the right time, which is really important. So as you're going through the process that we just covered, you can use this extended training to dive a lot deeper into some of those different steps. We also talk about some of the tech components and the tools and things like that. And so if you want to join in on that, you can head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop, and it's free to join. So you can head there, take a deeper dive into this. But again, I hope this was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.